Welcome. My name is Eric Joseph Soda, and I'm the President and CEO of the Northeastern Pennsylvania Industrial Resource Center. I thank you for investing your time in today's Cybersecurity 101 seminar. Cybersecurity threats are real, impactful, and potentially crippling to all types of businesses, but especially to our small to mid-sized manufacturers and our primary and secondary Department of Defense supply chain. By participating in today's seminar, your company is taking the first step in safeguarding the business and protecting your products, your people, your processes, and your key customers. The Northeastern Pennsylvania Industrial Resource Center, or NEPIRC, is pleased to bring this event to you as part of our mission to improve the competitiveness, vitality, viability, and resiliency of small and mid-sized manufacturers. Today's event will be moderated by Ms. Marla Hager, NEPIRC's Director of Client Development. Marla has been a valued member of our team since 2016 and has extensive experience in manufacturing, financial services, and healthcare management. As moderator, Marla will be facilitating discussion with two subject matter experts, Mark Gonzalez and Sam Lebdawi. Mark Gonzalez is a cybersecurity and business risk advisor with more than 30 years of professional experience. He's co-founder and co-owner of Site2, a data management firm that specializes in services for regulated or very sensitive industries, such as cybersecurity audits, data security training, controlled hack and unauthorized access tests, and so forth. Mark and his team specialize in organizations that need to achieve and maintain specific cybersecurity requirements, such as NIST 800-171 and ISO 27002. Mark holds a BS degree and MBA from the University of Scranton and a number of information systems certifications. As part of his personal mission to stop the bad guys, Mark sits on numerous advisory boards and information technology councils and professional associations. Sam Lebdawi is a senior cybersecurity analyst at Site2. In addition to a degree from Keystone College, Sam holds numerous professional certifications and designations, including that of CMMC Registered Practitioner. His client portfolio includes companies in the Department of Defense supply chain, as well as financial, healthcare, and education sectors. Today's event is being attended in person and live streamed on March 3rd, 2023. It's also being recorded for future download and viewing. If you're watching this event live on March 3rd, please feel free to enter your question or comments into the chat, and we'll try to answer those questions by the end of our program. If you're watching at a date later than March 3rd, please feel free to email your questions to info@nepirc.com, and we'll get you a prompt response. Thank you again for investing this time with us, and I'll turn the floor over to our moderator, and we'll get right into Cybersecurity 101.
Good morning, and thank you very much, Eric, for the introduction. I appreciate everybody's time today. Mark, Sam, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us. We appreciate it as well.
Yes, and cybersecurity is our topic of conversation today.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I'd like to also thank Eric for inviting us to be here as part of today's event. We really appreciate it, and the entire NEPIRC team for putting this event together. Before I get started, I wanted to address the proverbial elephant in the room. Cybersecurity, let's face it, is not a fun topic, right? As much as Sam and I are interested in cybersecurity, it's not like our friends and family invite us to parties to talk about cybersecurity and to do a comedy show on cybersecurity. But the reality is that cybersecurity creates for many people anxiety and stress. Part of it is because the topic that's foreign to many people. Part of it is because technology is evolving so quickly these days that it's hard to stay on top of it. Quite frankly, even for us, it's evolving so quickly. So speaking personally, when you talk about anxiety, one of the best ways that I deal with anxiety is by being prepared, by being educated and prepared for events like this or for cybersecurity threats. And so that's what we're hoping for today's event, to be an opportunity to prepare companies for being certified with the different Department of Defense certifications that are out there, and just in general for the defense industrial base to be better prepared for threats and vulnerabilities that are out there. So we're happy to be part of today's event and looking forward to get started.
All right, well, we are happy to have you today. So we were just going to look at the agenda at a high level today. So we're going to start about talking about securing the defense industrial base. We're also going to talk about the Defense Federal Acquisition Requirements, also known as DFARS. We're going to talk about NIST 800-171, CMMC version 1, the interim rule, CMMC version 2, and how NEPIRC and Site2 can assist organizations with their cybersecurity needs.
Sounds good. Well, since this workshop is Cybersecurity 101, we figured we'd go back in time to the good old days when you were talking about engineering diagrams or designs in general being on paper. You know, back in the 1950s and 60s, you would basically look to protect intellectual property or any kind of valuables using the castle doctrine, as they call it, which was basically, in the medieval days, the king and queen would put their most valuable jewels and prized possessions in the center of a castle, and they'd build walls around it and different physical defenses to try and protect their valuables. And businesses in the quote-unquote old days would do the same thing, right? They would take their sensitive information, their engineering diagrams that were on paper, and they'd put them in a safe, or they'd put them into a locked filing cabinet in an office building that would then have a locked door and perimeter security and other physical ways of defending against an adversary. But these days, now that engineering diagrams have moved to be digital, now you can use CAD technology in order to properly design and more effectively design engineering parts. Quite frankly, that's the promise of IT and technology, right? It's to advance efficiencies and make things more productive. So now that those technologies are all interconnected with the World Wide Web and the internet, you have more easy access to that sensitive information, right? We're all using smartphones and tablets and have technology where this sensitive information is broadly distributed and available. What for? For communication, for collaboration, for the better advancement of that technology. And so that is creating a vulnerability for that sensitive information. And we'd like to have this diagram to basically just talk about, you know, in general, the fact that our adversaries are looking to steal our sensitive information. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a particular comprehensive engineering diagram. It could be the pieces of the puzzle, right? If you get little pieces of a puzzle that eventually an adversary can piece together and figure out the advantages that we have on the battlefield, well, then it evens the battlefield, the playing field. You want to make sure that we continue to have our advantages. So we want to make sure that our adversaries are no longer able to get access to sensitive information and obviously protect our national posture when it comes to cybersecurity as well as defense security. So as a result, the Department of Defense created DFARS 252-204-7012, better known as 7012. And at this point, I'm going to pass the microphone to my esteemed colleague, Sam Labdawi, who's going to talk about that.
Yeah, so specifically here we have DFARS 252-204-7012, otherwise known as DFARS 7012. This was created, a regulation created in October of 2016 with the main intention of securing the supply chain within the defense industrial base. So basically, they wanted contractors and subcontractors to basically comply with NIST 800-171 framework, which is a framework full of 110 controls. So over the years, the defense industrial base, or the DoD, I should say, realized that contractors and subcontractors were the weakest link within the defense industrial base. So they originally put a deadline in there of December 31st of 2017 to protect controlled unclassified information.
And I guess that's the next question, is how do we define what is considered controlled unclassified information, otherwise known as CUI?
That brings us to the next slide.
Yep. So CUI is an umbrella term that includes DoD covered defense information, or CDI, and controlled technical information. So it's basically government data that requires safeguarding. So not really sensitive, or I'm sorry, it's not really classified information, but it is sensitive information that shouldn't get into the wrong hands.
So speaking of that, just if I can inquire, so how does a company know, like, this particular information, is this CUI or is it not CUI?
Yep, so typically within the contract, it'll have the DFARS 252, 204, 7012 in there. So you just have to look for that. And then sometimes, it depends on, the company. You might be actually creating CUI based off a request for proposal and what's in the actual proposal there.
Okay.
So some examples there that we have are research and engineering data or engineering diagrams. And then we have standards, manuals, technical reports and studies, and computer software executable code. So as I mentioned before, we have NIST 800-171 framework. This consists of 14 total families or domains. And each domain has its own set of controls. And then within those controls, there's a set of sub-controls, or as they say, assessment objectives. So in total, there are 110 controls and 320 assessment objectives.
All right, back to me. So this is just a simple diagram that we try to use to explain the inverse relationship between security and convenience, right? I mentioned earlier that technology is designed to help make things more convenient, more efficient, more productive. The unfortunate reality is a lot of systems that come off the shelf, whether it be the operating systems on your laptops or on servers, is they're designed for convenience. They're not designed for security. They're made and configured in such a way so that it is efficient and works quickly. And so when you start adding features that provide security, unfortunately, it does take away from some of those conveniences, but it's a requirement to try and make things more secure. So this just simply provides a visual representation of how, when we have a conversation about that relationship, unfortunately, people don't like to give up their conveniences, right? All of us want things to be easier. But in the end, with things like multi-factor authentication, it just requires one simple additional step when you're logging onto a computer system to make sure that it is actually you, as opposed to someone maybe potentially trying to impersonate you. So those are the types of things that we talk about when you're comparing security versus convenience.
So when we talk about NIST 800-171, what do companies need to be able to comply with that?
Yeah. So ultimately, NIST 800-171 is an all or nothing regulation and framework. You have to comply with all 110 controls. The reality is the Department of Defense realizes that not many companies in the defense industrial base have implemented all those 110 controls. So they wanted to start simply by having an organization create a leadership and governance committee around cybersecurity, that there are people that are buying in at the top of the organization and that are encouraging and making sure that the organization is leading by example. So it starts at that level. The other thing that we've already been told by the accreditation board is that if you don't have a system security plan, even if that system security plan doesn't outline how you're implementing all 110 controls, that you will immediately fail if there were to be an audit by either your prime contractor or by the Department of Defense itself. So that's one of the foundational documents that has to be created right from the beginning. And if there's any controls that are not currently in place in your organization, you need to have a plan of actions and milestones, which is effectively a project plan that outlines what are the remaining controls that still need to be employed and what is the timeline for those to be implemented, who is the owner of those tasks, to make sure that that organization is on a roadmap to compliance. So those are the basics, those are the foundational items that every organization has to at least start with. And keeping in mind, this all rolled out originally in 2016 and 2017. So companies that haven't even done this as a foundational step are already behind the curve and could face loss of contracts if they don't comply. So one of the lessons learned, obviously, when Marlo was going over the agenda, we saw a number of additional cybersecurity frameworks along the way. 7012 promoted and required that you implement NIST 800-171. And what we found was that because that framework initially has been all self-attestation, in other words, there weren't any auditors, or there's a very few number of auditors in the defense industrial base that go around actually auditing to make sure that you're complying with those 110 controls. We found that a lot of companies started kicking the can and avoiding the situation, looking for the day when there is actually going to be a so-called cybersecurity police that is going to be come by and ensuring that they comply. So the DoD realized this. They found that 9 out of 10 primes that they audited weren't even complying. So they feared that their subs were also avoiding the situation. We found that just having a plan wasn't enough. You can document a plan, but unless you're actually following the plan, you're not actually moving in the proper direction. And the other thing that really was the biggest pushback that we saw from manufacturers in the defense industrial base is that regardless of whether you were manufacturing a pencil or, to be funny, toilet paper for for the military, you still had to comply with all 110 controls. And those companies that were doing those off-the-shelf products felt that it was unfair, that it wasn't necessary for them to do all of those controls. So as a result, the Department of Defense responded and came out with a new regulation, which is CMMC. And with version 1 of CMMC, it implemented some of these additional controls, depending on who you were in the defense industrial base, what you were manufacturing, and the sensitivity of that information. So I'll pass the baton back to Sam.
Alrighty, thank you. Yeah, so CMMC version 1 originally had 5 different maturity levels, and then they also implemented an auditing type body, which is called the C3PAOs, which is the Certified Third-Party Assessment Organizations. And we have their contract acquisition go, no-go, basically saying that these contracts will now require a CMMC certification in order to win them. And it was built on NIST 800-171, and at the time for version 1, it was built NIST 800-171 plus an additional 20 controls. And then once you get audited and go through that auditing process and certification process, you would then get certified, and that certification would then last for the next 3 years. And then we have the DFARS interim rule that was created in 2019 as a bridge for NIST 800-171 going into CMMC compliance. So it basically required contractors to submit a score into the SPRS system, which is the Supplier Performance Risk System. You would either do a basic self-assessment or do a DIBCAC assessment. The scoring range, we have a bottom range there of -203 to the top score of 110.
So in regarding the scoring, so how does it get from a -203 to, because there's 110 controls.
Right.
So how does that range come about?
So it depends on the NIST methodology, and NIST methodology has different weights to certain controls. So some controls will have 5 points to it, and some will have 3, and then some will have 1 point. So when you are doing the assessment or the gap analysis portion of it, you start at 110, and then you subtract for every control that you don't have implemented.
That you're not complying with?
Right, exactly. Okay. And then the deadline was to enter that score by November 30th of 2020.
So what led to, because that's, I think it's confusing to a lot of people, CMMC version 1 never fully rolled out, and then they ended up creating CMMC version 2.
Right, that's correct. So that was because of, like we have up there, backlash and political heat. So the DoD took a whole year to just basically review the whole program, made some modifications, and they basically added some self-assessments for non-critical programs, making it a little bit easier on the contractors. So rulemaking is what we're looking for here. So rulemaking usually takes 9 to 24 months. The DoD just submitted the rule this February of this year. So we're looking at an estimate. Actually, I was just on a webinar this last Tuesday with the CMMC accreditation body, and they were estimating that CMMC will become law by 2024. So the last point there, all rules relate to the assessment of requirements that are an output of a rule that has been done since 2016. So basically, CMMC 2.0 is basically just the same thing as DFARS 7012, where you just have to comply with 800-171.
So is there, did they come up with an official date yet for the rollout, or is that still in the mix?
Still in the works.
Okay.
In the meantime, technically every organization still needs to comply with NIST 800-171.
If you have the DFARS clause in your contract.
Correct, yeah. So no organization should be waiting for CMMC 2.0, because until then it's an all or nothing. You should be complying with NIST 800-171 if you are the beneficiary of what 2.0 will have, which means that there are going to be only 3 maturity levels. And if you're at maturity level 1, you only need to implement 17 controls.
Yep. And
as a result of those, it's a much lighter lift than having to do all 110 controls.
Those would be the people, like you mentioned, that are doing pencils, toilet paper. They would...
the off-the-shelf products that the military still needs, but ultimately is going to go perhaps into a weapon or some kind of out in the field. And so it still needs to be, it's still considered controlled unclassified information.
Okay, and then so here we have a little diagram here of the key differences between CMMC 1.0 and 2.0. So we have on the left side the CMMC model 1.0 with level 1. We can start down there, which basically just has 17 practices, kind of like what Mark just mentioned, which is federal contract information only, which is basically anything like organizational charts, email exchanges between the DoD, or any type of small information similar to that. Then we have level 2, which is the intermediate transitional level, which was basically just 72 practices, more of a transitional level just to get to level 3. That got completely removed in the 2.0 model. And then if we look back on the 1.0 model, we have 130 practices for level 3, and then that basically transitioned now into level 2 on CMMC 2.0, which is 110 practices that's within NIST 800-171. If we look back again at 1.0, there's again another transitional level that got completely removed in the new model in 2.0, and then if we look back again at model 1.0, we have level 5, which is for advanced critical CUI programs. And then that got transferred over into level 3 in 2.0. So in July of 2022, the accreditation body created the CMMC assessment process document. This document is basically an overarching doctrine for C3PAOs, which are the auditors or the assessors. It's basically just procedures and guidelines that they would be going through when they're conducting an assessment. So this CAP document only applies to level 2 at the current moment, and it is tailored specifically for C3PAOs, CCAs, and CCPs, but it is intended for use for the whole entire ecosystem.
Any questions? All right. So this was just a slide to, basically we feel the pain of manufacturers that it's the fog of war, right? There's so much information that's coming out, not only from the Department of Defense, but just in general guidelines on best practices of how to secure your environment, how to protect your intellectual property, how to make sure that your proprietary information doesn't get in the wrong hands. And so what we'd like to do over the next couple of slides is just provide a little bit of guidelines on sequential steps that you can take to get started. Sometimes when you're facing something that's so overwhelming, the best thing is to chunk it out, get into little pieces and just get started. So the basic self-assessment is a service that NEPIRC and Site2 provide to organizations just simply to identify what their security posture is today. As it relates to the NIST 800-171 controls, as it relates to CMMC 2.0, so that if the organization hasn't yet created an SPRS score, you now will have it as a result of that gap analysis and can begin, whether you do work ongoing with Site2 and NEPIRC or with a different organization, if you try and implement the controls internally, you at least have that baseline score that you can proceed with. The next thing is, of course, that foundational document that I mentioned earlier, the SSP, that has to be done in the very beginning, and it could be bare bones, but it's going to identify critical personnel within an organization, who is the chief information security officer within the organization, who's the person that's receiving data from your upstream partners, who's the person that's sharing information with your downstream partners, what is your network or diagram, what does the network structure look like? Are you using cloud technologies? Do you have all your data on your in-house network? All those kind of details have to go into a system security plan so that the stakeholders and the Department of Defense know how you've implemented the 110 controls. And for any of the controls that you haven't implemented, as I mentioned earlier, the POAM, the Plan of Actions and Milestones, need to be created so that you can basically promise your stakeholders that you will eventually be compliant. Now, keep in mind, when CMMC does become law later this year or early 2024, all of the controls need to be implemented before contractors can apply for future contracts. Without having been audited and certified at 2.0, if you have controlled unclassified information, you will not be able to renew or win new work.
Mark, regarding the POAM, so is there a follow-up, like when this gets submitted, that are they checking at a certain point in time? Are you continuing to stay on target with meeting the requirements that you've laid out in the POAM as the company?
Yeah, great question. That's actually a question that comes up a lot with our clients is, if I have a terrible score, obviously a negative 203 means I'm not doing anything. I don't have any of the controls in place. I'm pretty much in trouble. I'm starting at the bare bones. Realistically, we kind of find small manufacturers to be somewhere in the negative 50s, that area when they're starting off, and then they move up. The DoD and the stakeholders, in other words, the primes or the entities that these subs are working for, have to encourage them to put in that initial score and then demonstrate progress as they improve, as opposed to just putting in the score once they reach 110. They want to know where you are today, and they want to see that you're making progress, as opposed to just waiting for the time when you're fully compliant.
So you would continue, as you make your progress, go in and update your score.
Correct.
And they would see that you're making positive progress.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
So one of the other big heavy lifts that most manufacturers often face when they're trying to implement NIST 800-171 and eventually CMMC is the policies and procedures. A lot of times, most organizations that are small or mid will say, yeah, when someone gets terminated, we make sure that their access is revoked. Well, is it a written policy? That is what often is missing, is that policy that says that when someone is terminated, that they have to have their permissions removed, and then the actual procedures, step by step, of how they go about doing that. Making sure that there's logging and audit trail to be able to demonstrate to auditors and stakeholders that you are actually following these procedures, the things that auditors are going to be looking for. And so many times organizations, small and mid, will not have the talent on staff to create these policies and procedures. And so we've developed the templates for all of the families that are associated with this compliance and regulation, and we can either provide them to the client or we can help them actually develop those policies and procedures. I think this is going to be you.
Yep. Yep. So we have up there on the top left, Control 311.2. So this has to do with the requirement of conducting risk assessments. And part of a risk assessment is a vulnerability assessment. And a vulnerability assessment is a periodic vulnerability scans to identify weaknesses within your IT systems. So in the diagram there, or in the screenshot there, we have different categories of severity levels. We have critical, high, medium, and low. It's very important in an organization to identify these vulnerabilities because those vulnerabilities will then be taken advantage of by threat actors and adversaries, and that's how they'll get their way in. So for example, if you have an external server that you're not scanning, you have no clue what's happening, or if it has any type of vulnerabilities, well, a threat actor could then take advantage of that vulnerability, get in through that external system, and then use that as a pivot to get into your internal network.
Sam, how often would a company do a vulnerability scan?
So it could be defined by the company itself. CMMC doesn't have an explicit requirement for the actual interval, but so you could either do a monthly or a quarterly scan, but that's the typical best practice, is to at least do it quarterly.
Okay, great, thank you.
And if I could add one thing about that. So we are not saying that these vulnerability scans needs to come out clean every time, right? These numbers shouldn't be that you have 0 under critical, 0 under high, and then the total is whatever it is. The reality is anytime that you make a change to a system, you're often introducing new vulnerabilities. So the point of having these scans is to identify the vulnerabilities that you may have introduced into your system through the normal course of work. You're going to be updating systems, you're going to be introducing new software. It's just part of normal IT work. And so if you're not doing these scans, you won't realize that perhaps you opened up a backdoor to your system as part of a recent upgrade or change.
So
that's
with that
the point
said,
of these.
would you recommend if somebody does make software changes at that point, after a certain point in time from that, a week, 2 weeks, they should do a vulnerability scan?
Well, system updates should be scheduled, and typically we do schedule scans to be in line with those changes. Changes are usually the number one way of introducing a vulnerability into the network because you're making a modification.
Then here on the top left, we have control 331 through 6 and 338 through 9. This all has to do with audit and accountability, a very big requirement in CMMC. It has to do with event retention, aggregation, analysis, monitoring, and alerting. So what we'll typically do for our clients is we'll hook up a security information event management system, otherwise known as a SIM. This will basically aggregate and correlate logs from various different sources, whether it's your software, hardware. You'll have your firewalls, your switches, pretty much your whole network, right? And it's very important to have this on hand. We'll have a 24/7 SOC that looks through all of the logs that go throughout your network and all the systems to ensure and make sure that there are no anomalous activities. And if there are anomalous activities or incidents that are happening, or any breaches, then they will alert the security personnel either by phone or through a ticket. And then event retention is very important, especially when there could be an incident. You want to be able to retain those logs for your insurance provider and investigations. And then we have control 361, and then we have 314, 2, 4, and 5. 361 has to do with the incident response capabilities. And then we have 314, 2, 4, and 5, which have to do with system and information integrity. So we have up there listed antivirus and EDR. Antivirus, its main function is to look for malicious files, known malicious files, I should say, based on, I'm drawing a blank, signatures. And then we have EDR, which is supposed to be looking for anomalous activity or malicious activity. And then we have here 342, 353, 313.8, and 363. There we have listed secure configurations. This is also a very important part, a requirement of CMMC. So what we'll typically do is implement CIS benchmarks, which stands for Center of Internet Security. It's basically guidelines and industry best practices on how to configure all your systems, whether it's workstation servers, your firewalls, or switches. And then we have MFA, which is multi-factor authentication. This is also a requirement. It's basically just another step before authentication. Typically, it would be just another step on your phone. You'd install an application, and then once you're actually trying to log into your computer, it'll then prompt you on your phone to either accept it or enter in a code. Then we have spam and spoof filtering with real-time blacklist. This will basically blacklist any known or malicious IPs or domains. And then we have DMARC and SPF records, which will basically ensure the integrity of the actual email that you've got. Make sure it's not spoofed. Anybody, sometimes they have spear phishing attacks where someone will spoof an email, make it look like it's coming from somebody in your organization. And then we have encryption, which is also very important. We have Zix Encrypt policy-based/lexicons. So in case somebody doesn't follow procedures and ends up entering a social security number within an email or any type of sensitive information, the lexicons will pick that up and encrypt it automatically, making sure that that sensitive information isn't just plain text. And then lastly, we have the social engineering testing with simulated phishing attacks. Well, that's kind of it has to do with penetration testing a little bit there, but we'll test your employees on a quarterly basis to make sure that, hey, we're going to give you a phishing email. We won't let the employees know and see if they're going to click on it. If they do click on it, then we'll provide a report on who those individuals are, provide that with the leadership team, and then they'll go on with some more training.
So security awareness training is really one of the main things when the director of CISA was interviewed online on the internet, and they said if there was one thing that you could communicate in general to the population, business population as well as users, what was the one thing that you would make sure that your employees know? And it's just basic awareness training. There's so the slide that was here previously that Sam was alluding to, this is all primarily controls around email. And email is the biggest threat platform because it's how we communicate, it's how we collaborate. A lot of times you're attaching sensitive information into email and you're sharing it between organizations. And email, in some ways, if you don't have your network configured properly, bypasses a lot of your firewall and other security settings. So it's really important that your employee base is aware of the different things that they are responsible for. A lot of employees never were trained in cybersecurity, or never, if they went for engineering or they went for accounting in school, and now they're in a business and all of a sudden they're being told that, hey, part of your responsibility is cybersecurity. Well, you need to be very clear with them on what those responsibilities are and what to look for, whether it be in an email or otherwise. So we like to say that cybersecurity is a team sport. For you to be able to succeed on the field of business, you need to make sure that all of your team members are playing according to the same playbook, and really you're only as good as your weakest link. All it takes is one employee to ultimately undermine an organization's security by clicking on an email link or doing something that they shouldn't have done.
So how often would you recommend an organization train their employees in cybersecurity awareness?
So at least on an annual basis, every person within different categories should have training. So for example, system administrators should have high-level training because they have access to all of the information and all the components of the network. Then managers should have training because they should be able to recognize if there's any kind of nefarious activity going on, if employees are doing things that they shouldn't do. And then of course there should be general awareness training for all the employees to be able to recognize things like email attachments that they shouldn't click on or that they shouldn't be sending. So yeah, at least on an annual basis, but for all those three groups at least. And to Sam's point, if someone falls victim to an email, then it demonstrates that they need additional training. So that means that the training may have to happen more than once in a particular year for that individual. Looks like we have a question from the audience. Are you required to obtain compliance documentation from third-party cloud-based app vendors? That's a great question, and that's actually one of the things that is being debated right now as part of the rule rollout is, do cloud providers have to be FedRAMP certified or CMMC certified? Do they have to have some other kind of certification just simply to be a consultant like Site2 is, or actually be able to host the data? And the answer is it's leaning towards yes. So if you're going to be using a provider, one of the examples is, for example, Microsoft Office 365. A lot of companies are now turning to Microsoft Office 365 for their email platform, for their online file sharing, using products like Teams. Microsoft has now come out with a new version of Office 365 called GCC. It's the government certified edition. It means that all of the data is retained in the United States. It means that all of the employees are US-based employees. And so if you are going to be a Department of Defense contractor, you have to use GCC as opposed to just plain old Microsoft 365. Of course, that comes at an additional cost, yes, and there's additional controls associated with that, but that is one of the examples that cloud providers, you have to turn to cloud providers that are providing the more advanced security features.
So that would be anyone for complying with NIST 800-171 or the upcoming CMMC 2.0?
CMMC maturity level 2.
2
yeah.
or higher?
Yes,
okay,
correct.
Great.
Yep. All right, so Sam alluded to a little bit about penetration testing. Penetration testing is a service that we provide. It's a requirement of CMMC and NIST 800-171 because it identifies vulnerabilities on the client network. So we talked earlier a little bit about scans. Scans are done periodically after you've already done a penetration test, because penetration tests are going to identify, what is the low-hanging fruit? What would a potential attacker or adversary look to as a methodology to gain access to your network and to sensitive information? And so a penetration test basically simulates what an attacker would do by an ethical hacker like Sam to go in and exploit potentially those vulnerabilities and demonstrate in a report back to the company what are the things that they need to button up and do better. This is something that obviously you would only do once you've actually implemented all 110 controls. It's kind of unfair to an organization for somebody to come in and do a penetration test when you don't have any security in place. So this is usually one of the final steps. It could be a good early step to just highlight for organizations where they may not believe that they have vulnerabilities. You can highlight them for them because everyone has vulnerabilities, and ultimately anyone can be truly hacked into given them enough time and persistence. But this is certainly one of the things that organizations are going to need to do as part of compliance.
And Mark, how often would you recommend an organization do penetration testing?
At least annually. Yeah, it is best practice to do it annually. Some organizations do it more frequently, semi-annually.
And would that have any bearing on where they are in the CMMC levels?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's typically something that you would wait to do once you've already implemented all 110 controls of NIST 800-171, or you're close to the end. It's something that's more reserved for a mature organization. Before that, what we would do is just simply do a security assessment or a gap analysis that identifies known gaps in your network. But penetration tests can sometimes be intrusive and can be risky to the organization if they don't have controls in place. They could lead to downtime for the organization if they're not prepared for it.
Okay.
So we covered a lot, and for those of you who are being introduced to NIST 800-171, the DFARS clause, the eventual CMMC 2.0 for the very first time, this could be a lot to absorb. The good news is that we're going to have another session in 3 weeks where we're going to get a little deeper dive into some of these controls and subcontrols, share more information on what you need in order to be compliant. But in summary, there were some lessons learned. The defense industrial base, the Department of Defense had great intentions by rolling out DFARS 7012. They realized that their adversaries were gaining access to the defense industrial base, to secrets, to proprietary information. So they rolled out that clause and made it a requirement that if you were being shared controlled unclassified information, you had to protect it, and you had to protect it adequately. So they defined NIST 800-171 as that first level. Obviously, there was pushback, and rightly so. There are organizations that don't need to implement all 110 controls. And so those organizations, when CMMC 2.0 comes out, will only need to comply with the 17 foundational controls. But we're seeing that over the course of the next 12 to 18 months, CMMC 2.0 will become a reality. And so this is basically a warning to organizations who have been kicking the can down the road that the time is now to get started, because it does take 12 to 18 months to implement all 110 controls if you haven't done it before. It requires a phased rollout. And as a result, basically NEPIRC and Site2 are here to help.
Absolutely, and it seems we do have another question. So how does being cyber secure impact work remotely? Can some people still work from home or virtually?
Yes, and that is a big debate as far as home networks, right? So when people work from home, they typically are using infrastructure that is shared by the family. You maybe are using on a Wi-Fi network at home that your family is using, your kids might be using for gaming, for social media, for surfing the web, for shopping online. And all of those expose your company data to additional vulnerabilities if you are not keeping things separate. So technically under CMMC, an employee that works for an organization that needs to comply with CMMC should be using a separate internet connection, separate Wi-Fi, a firewall at home, and actually are supposed to be locking their home office where their computer for work is being used at the end of the day. So there are strict controls associated with working from home if you fall under CMMC and NIST 800-171 with the controlled and classified information.
So speaking of that for CMMC, so would that apply if you're level 2 and higher?
Yes, correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yes, exactly.
Good question. Do we have any other questions?
Move to the Q&A slide.
Oh,
Yes.
Will organizations need to be certified if they do not handle CUI?
Yes. So whether you handle CUI or not, under CMMC, you will need to, let me take a step back. Under CMMC 2.0, you will not need to be certified if you have those off-the-shelf products that we talked about, and you only need to comply with maturity level 1. Once you get to maturity level 2, because you have controlled unclassified information, the contract will dictate whether or not you need to be certified before you can win the contract. So there will be agreements, from what we understand, a minority of agreements at the level 2 that will not require an organization to be pre-certified before they can win the work.
but it will note that in the
Correct.
contract.
Yes.
Okay.
Otherwise, the presumption has to be that when you're dealing with controlled unclassified information, you will need to comply fully and be certified before you can win or renew the work.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other
I
questions?
do have one more
Okay.
question. if
Sure.
That's okay.
Of course.
Can you please speak to the difference between IT best practices that every organization should implement and CMMC required cybersecurity protocols?
So CMMC is basically industry best practices, basically defined under a framework. So it goes back to the whole relationship between convenience and security, the inverse relationship there. If you're talking an organization that does not need to be CMMC or NIST 800-171 compliant because they're not doing work potentially for the Department of Defense or are regulated in another way, like healthcare information or financial information, it's really up to them what their risk tolerance is. But all of the controls that are in CMMC are basically industry best practices. Will an organization that is not regulated or being audited choose to implement all those controls? Likely not, because it's a balance, again, between convenience and security, and there's a cost associated with it. But ultimately, all of the controls that are in CMMC are considered industry best practices. Yep.
And it looks like we do have
We might be getting another
another
question there
question coming in.
from online, I guess it is.
I'll just speak to it.
Okay.
Okay, so if Site2 helps create the required system documentation, will they also be able to audit the work?
No. Yeah, so it's a matter of checks and balances. If we are hired to help an organization to comply, we can't also be a C3PAO. Now, Site2 as an organization could provide both services, but the client that we help to prepare for an audit, we can't also audit.
Even if it's different personnel within the
Correct.
organization.
Yes,
Okay.
that's the indication that we're receiving right now. Yes.
I got a question.
Yes.
You guys are coming out to our facility and you're going to help us prepare for CMMC. Afterwards, would you be able to recommend an organization that come audit us, because that was a very difficult task, trying to find someone who can do this.
Yeah, it's not best practice for us to provide a recommendation. We should not be providing a recommendation. So as a result, the CMMC accreditation body has published all of their C3PAOs on their website. There are now 37 organizations that have been certified to do the work, which is a big accomplishment in the past year. Obviously, there were 0 about a year ago.
Just to go back on that,
Yeah.
I did go to that website, I believe it was last year, and I was trying to make contact with some of the organizations, and most of the contact information was dead, going nowhere.
Okay. That's feedback that we can certainly try to provide to the accreditation body. It could be, and this is just my commentary, it's not necessarily the official commentary of the accreditation body, but it could be that because some companies prepared vigorously to be able to do audits for CMMC version 1 when it first came out, the fact that there was now a pivoting period of well over a year before they would need to be able to be in a position to gain work for 2.0. I know that some companies became disenchanted by that and stopped offering services. Others waited for that to become law so that they can get retrained and recertified on doing the audits. So it's kind of unfortunately been a wait and see. But now that we're coming close to the finish line where it will become law, I suspect that some of those companies will be retrained and will become able to provide the service again. Another question? Yeah.
Does the accreditation body require any type of SOC 2 reports for the organization that's providing the service?
No, I mean the SOC 2 audit is another way of demonstrating that you have a number of different controls in place. For organizations like Site2, that has been talked about as potentially a requirement for those organizations. So far what they're saying is that organizations like Site2 will also have to be CMMC audited and certified before they're able to provide the ongoing services as an advisor and practitioners. But at this point, there's no requirement for SOC 2. It is a good certification certainly to have, and we do have that.
All right. Any other questions? Well, thank you so much for your time today, Sam. Mark, thank you so much.
Pleasure.
We really
Thank you.
appreciate being a partner with you and for assisting with the cybersecurity needs of our local manufacturers. So thank you so much for your time today.
It's our pleasure. Thank
And
you.
We will be back on March 24th. Thanks so much.